The dining room hums with the Friday night energy of expensive wine and business deals, but Claire sees the pre-action anxiety of three men closing in on table 12. As she balances a bottle of Barolo, worth more than 2 days of her wages, she watches the tells of professional killers, the rigid posture, the obsessive watch-checking, and the synchronized surveillance of the exits. She isn't just serving wine, she is walking into a kill zone. The air inside the Golden Fork was a suffocating blend of expensive perfume, seared wagyu, and the metallic tang of impending violence that only Claire Sterling seemed to smell. She moved through the dining room with the practiced, invisible precision of someone who understood that in a place like this, image was the only currency that mattered. At 26, Claire had mastered the art of the approachable mask, a slight tilt of the head, a neutral but warm smile, and a posture that suggested she was always available but never intrusive. It was a necessity in the service industry, where her rent was paid by the whims of people who liked her just enough to leave a decent tip. But beneath the white tablecloths and the flickering amber glow of the candles, Claire was doing much more than serving. Her degree in criminal psychology was a silent companion that turned every shift into a laboratory. While her coworker Rosa saw a room full of hungry socialites and generous businessmen, Claire saw a complex web of social hierarchies and unspoken tensions. Tonight, however, the patterns she usually decoded for fun had shifted into something far more predatory. The alarm bells in her head weren't just ringing. They were a deafening siren that she had to drown out just to keep her hands from shaking. She clutched a bottle of Barolo to her chest, a vintage that cost more than she earned in 2 full shifts, and began the long walk toward table 12. Every step felt like wading through deep water. To her left, at table 8, sat the man in the charcoal suit. He was an expert at looking like he belonged, but Claire had spotted the tells an hour ago. He had ordered 3 drinks and touched none of them, a classic sign of someone who needed to keep their motor skills sharp while maintaining a normal appearance. His back was too straight, his shoulders too tense, and his eyes, they never lingered on his plate. Instead, they drifted with a professional, peripheral awareness toward table 12 every few minutes. Claire's mind raced, cataloging the data points. A man checking his watch with obsessive regularity is a man operating on a precise, non-negotiable timeline. She passed the bar where the second man sat. He was older, mid-30s, wearing Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He had been nursing the same whiskey for 45 minutes, his body positioned to monitor both the main entrance and the kitchen corridor. He kept adjusting the hem of his jacket, a repetitive gesture often used to ensure a concealed weapon hasn't shifted or become visible. Finally, there was the third man near the restrooms, the youngest of the trio. He was the leak in their professional facade, vibrating with a nervous energy that manifested in constant motion. He was drumming silent rhythms against his thigh and checking his phone every 30 seconds, his eyes darting to the back exit, the very route Dominic Valley always took when he left. Earth to Claire, Rosa's voice had cut through her thoughts earlier, but now the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into a dull, underwater hum. Claire reached the edge of table 12. Dominic Valley sat alone, as he always did on Friday nights. He had been coming here for 3 months, and in that time, Claire had never figured out why a man of his stature, a man who clearly had better places to be, chose the Golden Fork. As she stepped into his personal space, the air grew colder. Dominic looked up, and for the first time, his storm-gray eyes didn't just glance at her, they conducted a full-scale interrogation of her face. In that look, Claire saw the reflection of her own realization. He knew. He was sitting in the center of a kill zone, his back to the wall, his hands resting on the table with a stillness that was even more terrifying than the assassin's jitters. He wasn't surprised to see the hunters. He was just waiting for the first move. Claire began to present the wine, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. "The Barolo you requested, Mr. Valley," she murmured. Her training told her that the three men were exhibiting pre-action anxiety, the elevated breathing and hypervigilance that precedes a significant violent event. She was standing directly in the line of fire between table 8 and table 12. Dominic's gaze dropped to the bottle, then back to her eyes. There was a silent plea there, or perhaps a warning. The bold risk she was about to take wasn't born out of a desire to be a hero. It was the result of a psychological compulsion to disrupt a pattern she found unacceptable. She realized that if she simply poured the wine and walked away, Dominic Valley would be dead before she reached the service station. The man at the bar shifted his weight, his hand moving toward his jacket. The man at table 8 took a deep, stabilizing breath. The younger man at the back stood up. The timeline was expiring. Claire felt the weight of the heavy glass bottle in her hand and the proximity of Dominic's presence. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was the only variable the assassins hadn't accounted for, the criminal psychology student who had seen the secrets they tried to hide. "Enjoy your evening, Dominic," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the dining room's roar. She didn't move to pour the wine. Instead, she tightened her grip on the bottle and prepared to shatter the approachable image she had spent years perfecting. The dining room of the Golden Fork didn't just hum. It throbbed with the synthetic pulse of Chicago's elite, a demographic Claire Sterling had spent 3 years cataloging from behind the safety of a starched black apron. She was 26, an age where most of her peers were climbing corporate ladders or finishing residencies, yet she stood at the precipice of a different kind of mastery. Her degree in criminal psychology was supposed to be a ticket to a windowless office at the FBI. Instead, it had turned her into the most dangerous observer in the room, the person who saw the predator before the prey even felt the chill in the air. Claire smoothed her apron, her fingers grazing the fabric with a mechanical precision meant to settle her own rising heart rate. She checked her reflection in the polished chrome of the espresso machine, ensuring her blonde hair was still twisted into the severe, professional bun that acted as her armor. She needed to look confident, invisible, and utterly unremarkable, the perfect mask for a woman who was currently dissecting the room's tactical layout. The surveillance was elegant in its simplicity. Table 8 held the lookout, a man in a charcoal suit whose expensive tailoring couldn't hide the rigid set of his shoulders. He had ordered 3 drinks and touched none, his eyes locked on a precise, obsessive timeline that Claire could practically see ticking behind his pupils. At the bar, the heavy sat nursing a single whiskey, his Italian leather shoes gleaming under the pendant lights as he constantly adjusted the hem of his jacket, a tell as loud as a gunshot to someone trained to look for concealed carry. And near the restrooms, the leak, a younger man vibrating with the nervous motion of a novice facing his first real execution. Dominic Valley sat at table 12, a man who possessed secrets that Claire's degree had taught her to recognize but never fully decode. He was the target, the center of the kill zone, and as Claire approached with the bottle of Barolo, worth more than 2 days of her grueling shifts, his storm-gray eyes met hers. In that gaze, the approachable image she worked so hard to maintain shattered. He knew he was trapped, and for a heartbeat, Claire wasn't a waitress. She was his only accomplice in a room full of ghosts. The man at the bar shifted. It was a subtle movement, a minute adjustment of his weight that signaled the end of the observation phase and the beginning of the action. Claire felt the pre-action anxiety of the trio reach a fever pitch, elevated breathing, hypervigilance, and the synchronized tightening of a trap. The alarm bells in her head, once a whisper, were now a roar. She reached table 12. The bottle of Barolo felt heavy in her hand, less like a luxury beverage and more like a tactical tool. Dominic was still, unnervingly so, his hands resting near the edge of the table as if waiting for the first crack of thunder. Claire didn't move to pour. Instead, her eyes darted to the bar, catching the glint of the man's hand moving toward the hidden weight beneath his Italian wool jacket. The risk was irrational. It was the antithesis of everything her psychology training taught her about self-preservation. But as she saw the charcoal suit at table 8 take a stabilizing breath, the kind of breath a marksman takes before a trigger pull, Claire Sterling acted. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the bottle. With a calculated, intentional stumble, she tilted the Barolo. The deep, blood-red liquid didn't just spill. It erupted across the pristine white tablecloth, a violent splash of crimson that mimicked the gore to come. It was a jarring, discordant note in the symphony of the golden fork. The man at the bar flinched, his hand stalling on the grip of his weapon as his eyes instinctively tracked the sudden movement and the sound of gasping diners at neighboring tables. Dominic Valley didn't flinch. He used the microsecond of the distraction to slide his chair back, his storm gray eyes fixed on Claire with a terrifying intensity. She had broken the pattern. She had introduced a variable the professional surveillance team hadn't accounted for in their cold, precise timeline. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Valley," Claire gasped, her voice loud enough to carry, her hands shaking with a blend of feigned incompetence and very real adrenaline. She began to frantically dab at the red stain with a cloth, her body positioned intentionally to obscure the line of sight from table 8. The air in the room didn't just feel thick. It felt electric, the tension ready to arc into violence at the slightest provocation. Claire looked down at the soaked linen, the smell of the Barolo filling her senses, realizing she had just crossed a line from which there was no retreat. She wasn't just observing the criminals anymore, she was playing their game. The heavy bottle of Barolo in Claire Sterling's hand felt less like a luxury vintage and more like a live grenade as the air in the golden fork curdled with the unmistakable scent of a pending execution. Her training in criminal psychology, the very degree she thought would lead her to a clinical office rather than a service station, screamed at her that the pre-action anxiety in the room had reached its breaking point. She watched the man at the bar adjust his jacket, a telltale twitch that signaled he was clearing his path to a concealed weapon, and she knew the countdown had reached 0. The risk was irrational, a total abandonment of the approachable, competent image she had spent years cultivating to ensure her survival in Chicago's elite dining scene. But as she saw the man in the charcoal suit at table 8 take a deep, stabilizing breath and center his focus on Dominic Valley's chest, the detached observer in Claire died. She didn't just spill the wine, she committed to a tactical disruption. With a sharp, intentional jerk of her wrist, she sent the blood-red liquid erupting across the pristine white tablecloth in a violent splash that mimicked the carnage about to unfold. Dominic's storm-gray eyes flashed, not with surprise, but with a lethal, sudden understanding. He recognized the distraction for what it was. As the man at the bar hesitated, his hand stalling on the grip of his pistol due to the unexpected stimulus of the red wine gore, Claire didn't retreat. She leaned into the chaos. The man at table 8 was faster than the amateur near the restrooms. He stood, the charcoal wool of his suit jacket flaring as he drew a suppressed handgun with a motion so practiced it was almost beautiful. Time seemed to dilate, stretching the dining room's ambient roar into a slow, underwater thrum. Claire saw the muzzle clear the table's edge. She didn't think about the physics of the bullet or the trajectory. She simply threw her weight against the heavy mahogany edge of Dominic's table. The table lurched, the screech of wood against the floor echoing like a preemptive scream. Dominic was already moving, sliding out of his chair with the predatory grace of a man who had survived a dozen such nights, but it was Claire's shove that changed the world. The assassin's first shot didn't find Dominic's heart. Instead, the phut of the suppressed round hissed through the space where his head had been a microsecond prior, shattering a $1,000 bottle of vintage brandy on the back shelf. Glass rained down like diamonds as the effortless grace of the golden fork finally disintegrated. Rose's scream pierced the air, a high-pitched signal that the masquerade was over. Claire felt the heat of the second round pass near her shoulder, a terrifying reminder that in the eyes of the men in the charcoal suits, she was no longer just a waitress, she was a target. Dominic's hand clamped onto her arm, his grip like iron, pulling her down as the dining room erupted into a stampede of terrified socialites and crashing silverware. The bold risk had been taken. The line between the observer and the participant was gone forever. The sound was not the deafening roar of a cannon, but a sickening, localized hiss, the sound of compressed air and a lead slug tearing through the refined atmosphere of the Golden Fork. For a microsecond, the dining room held its breath, suspended in a state of collective disbelief. Then, the bottle of vintage brandy on the back shelf behind table 12 disintegrated. The spray of glass and amber liquid rained down like a glittering, lethal curtain, and the silence shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Rosa was the first to scream. It was a high, thin sound that cut through the low-frequency hum of the city's elite like a razor. She had been standing near the service station, her arms still empty from her last delivery, her body frozen in a posture of effortless grace that was instantly replaced by raw, primal terror. That scream was the starting gun. The dining room, once a carefully curated stage of subtle hierarchies and expensive wine, devolved into a panicked stampede. Socialites who had spent the evening discussing mergers and winter galas were suddenly on all fours, crawling over white linen and discarded silverware. To Claire's left, a table of 4 overturned with a crash that sounded like another gunshot, sending crystal flutes of champagne shattering across the floor. Claire felt the heat of the second round as it whistled past her shoulder, a terrifying confirmation that her bold risk had moved her from the role of a clinical observer to a primary target. Her psychology training had taught her about the fight or flight response, but witnessing the total collapse of social order in real time was different. The well-dressed crowd was no longer a group of individuals. They were a panicked herd, their expensive Italian shoes slipping on spilled Barolo and broken glass as they surged toward the main entrance. Through the haze of smoke and the spray of wine, Claire saw the man in the charcoal suit from table 8 rising, his face a mask of cold, professional frustration. He had lost the precise timeline he'd been obsessing over, and he was now adjusting his aim to compensate for the chaos Claire had introduced. Dominic's hand clamped onto her arm with the strength of a vice. He didn't wait for her to recover from the shock. He pulled her downward, using the overturned mahogany table as a shield. "Move," he barked, his voice cutting through the din of breaking china and the frantic shouts of the kitchen staff. Claire looked back once. She saw Rosa crouched behind the bar, her hands over her ears, the image of the perfect server gone, replaced by a woman paralyzed by the sudden eruption of the underworld into her workspace. The synchronized timing Claire had decoded earlier was gone, replaced by a frantic, messy scramble for survival. They had to move now, before the man at the bar or the younger man near the restrooms could close the distance. The Golden Fork was no longer a restaurant. It was a labyrinth of fire, glass, and shadows. Claire scrambled after Dominic, her knees hitting the hard tile as they surged toward the only exit the hit squad hadn't yet fully choked, the kitchen corridor. The sound was not a deafening boom, but a sickening, localized hiss, the sound of a suppressed lead slug tearing through the refined atmosphere of the Golden Fork. For a microsecond, the dining room held its breath, suspended in a state of collective disbelief. Then, the bottle of vintage brandy on the back shelf behind table 12 disintegrated. The spray of glass and amber liquid rained down like a glittering, lethal curtain, and the silence shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Rosa was the first to scream. It was a high, thin sound that cut through the low-frequency hum of the city's elite like a razor. She had been standing near the service station, her arms still empty from her last delivery, her body frozen in a posture of effortless grace that was instantly replaced by raw, primal terror. That scream was the starting gun. The dining room, once a carefully curated stage of subtle hierarchies and expensive wine, devolved into a panicked stampede. Socialites who had spent the evening discussing mergers and winter galas were suddenly on all fours, crawling over white linen and discarded silverware. To Claire Sterling's left, a table of 4 overturned with a crash that sounded like another gunshot, sending crystal flutes of champagne shattering across the floor. Claire felt the heat of the second round as it whistled past her shoulder, a terrifying confirmation that her bold risk had moved her from the role of a clinical observer to a primary target. Her psychology training had taught her about the fight or flight response, but witnessing the total collapse of social order in real time was different. The well-dressed crowd was no longer a group of individuals. They were a panicked herd, their expensive Italian shoes slipping on spilled Barolo and broken glass as they surged toward the main entrance. Through the haze of smoke and the spray of wine, Claire saw the man in the charcoal suit from Table 8 rising, his face a mask of cold, professional frustration. He had lost the precise timeline he'd been obsessing over, and he was now adjusting his aim to compensate for the chaos Claire had introduced. Dominic Valley's hand clamped onto her arm with the strength of a vice. He didn't wait for her to recover from the shock. He pulled her downward, using the overturned mahogany table as a shield. "Move," he barked, his voice cutting through the din of breaking china and the frantic shouts of the kitchen staff. Claire looked back once. She saw Rosa crouched behind the bar, her hands over her ears, the image of the perfect server gone, replaced by a woman paralyzed by the sudden eruption of the underworld into her workspace. The synchronized timing Claire had decoded earlier was gone, replaced by a frantic, messy scramble for survival. They had to move now, before the man at the bar or the younger man near the restrooms could close the distance. The Golden Fork was no longer a restaurant. It was a labyrinth of fire, glass, and shadows. Claire scrambled after Dominic, her knees hitting the hard tile as they surged toward the only exit the hit squad hadn't yet fully choked, the kitchen corridor. Claire's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a stark contrast to the cold, analytical part of her brain that had taken over the moment the first suppressed shot hissed through the air of the Golden Fork. As she and Dominic ducked into the dim, stainless steel labyrinth of the kitchen corridor, the sounds of the panicked stampede in the dining room began to muffle, replaced by the industrial hum of walk-in freezers and the distant clatter of abandoned pans. Her psychology training, once a purely academic exercise in decoding tells across white tablecloths, was now a visceral survival map. She knew they weren't safe yet. The youngest member of the hit squad had been stationed specifically to cut off this exit. "Stay low," Dominic hissed, his voice like gravel. The storm-gray eyes she had analyzed earlier were now sharp and lethal, scanning the shadows for the threat they both knew was waiting. Claire didn't need to see the gunman to know exactly where he would be and, more importantly, what state of mind he would be in. Her mind flashed back to the younger man at the small table near the restrooms. He was the leak in their professional perimeter, the one who couldn't stay still, who checked his phone every 30 seconds, and who drummed silent, jagged rhythms against his thigh. In criminal psychology terms, he was a powder keg of nervous energy. He wasn't a seasoned professional like the man in the charcoal suit at Table 8. He was a novice experiencing a massive surge of adrenaline that he didn't know how to channel. This made him dangerous, but it also made him predictable. Claire knew his pre-action anxiety would lead to a tunnel vision effect. He would be hyper-focused on the door at the end of the corridor, his breathing shallow, his finger likely twitching on the trigger as he waited for his first real kill. They reached a blind corner near the heavy industrial dishwashers. Claire grabbed Dominic's arm, signaling him to stop. She could hear it, the rhythmic, sharp click-click-click of a pen or a lighter. It was the same restless drumming he'd exhibited in the dining room. He was right around the bend, probably 10 feet from the heavy steel door that led to the alleyway. "He's terrified," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's going to fire the second he sees movement. He won't wait to identify the target." She looked at Dominic, her mind racing through the behavioral profiles of high-stress shooters. We have to break his rhythm. If we can trigger his startle response, his aim will pull wide to the right. He's right-handed. I saw him straightening his silverware with his right hand earlier. Dominic nodded, a grim ghost of a smile touching his lips as he realized the waitress wasn't just a witness. She was a tactical asset. He reached for a heavy stack of metal trays perched precariously on a prep table. On Claire's silent count of 3, Dominic shoved the trays. They hit the tile floor with a deafening, metallic crash that echoed through the narrow space like a bomb. Exactly as Claire anticipated, the young gunman's nervous system overloaded. A muffled phut sounded as he fired blindly toward the source of the noise, the round burying itself harmlessly into a plastic bin of flour. Before he could recalibrate his focus, Dominic was a blur of motion. He rounded the corner while the gunman was still blinking back the adrenaline-induced tunnel vision, his shoulders hunched in a defensive posture. Claire followed, seeing the younger man's eyes wide with the raw, unrefined fear she had diagnosed from across the restaurant. He tried to bring the weapon up again, but his movements were jerky and uncoordinated. Dominic didn't give him a second chance. With a brutal efficiency that spoke of his own dark history, Dominic disarmed him, the sound of the gunman's wrist snapping puncturing the heavy silence of the kitchen. The gunman collapsed, clutching his arm, his breath coming in the ragged, sobbing gasps of someone who had completely lost control of his physiological responses. Dominic didn't linger. He grabbed Claire's hand, his grip firm and steady. The bold risk she had taken by spilling the wine had led them here, and as they stepped over the defeated shooter and pushed through the heavy steel door into the cold Chicago night, Claire realized her life as a simple observer was over. The cold Chicago air hit Claire Sterling with a visceral sharpness that finally cut through the metallic, copper-tinged scent of adrenaline and gunpowder that had choked her in the kitchen corridor. As they stumbled out of the heavy steel service door, the muffled silence of the alleyway was a stark, jarring contrast to the violent cacophony they had left behind at the Golden Fork. Her lungs burned, drawing in gulps of the frigid night as she looked at her hands, still faintly stained with the Barolo she had used to shatter a professional hit squad's lethal rhythm. Beside her, Dominic Valley moved with a predatory energy that was beginning to fracture, the storm-gray eyes she had so carefully analyzed now wide and searching the darkness for the next threat. The professional facade she had watched for 3 months, the wealthy, mysterious regular who occupied table 12 with a terrifying, silent stillness, was cracking in real time. Dominic leaned heavily against a soot-stained brick wall, his chest heaving as he checked the magazine of the weapon he had liberated from the younger gunman in the corridor. In the harsh, flickering light of a nearby street lamp, Claire saw a man who was no longer just a figure in her psychological profiles. The secrets she had sensed, the tells she had struggled to decode, were suddenly written in the jagged lines of his face and the desperate way he scanned the street. He wasn't just a boss, he was a survivor who had just realized his luck had nearly run out. "You," he rasped, the word catching in his throat as he finally looked at her, really looked at her, without the barrier of a dinner menu or a wine list. "Why did you do it? You saw them. You knew what was coming before I did." His voice was stripped of its usual commanding authority, revealing a raw, jagged edge of disbelief. He was a man who lived in a world where everyone had a price or a motive, yet he had been saved by a waitress who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Claire felt the weight of her own bold risk settling in her stomach like lead. Her degree in criminal psychology had given her the tools to see the pre-action anxiety and the synchronized timing of his hunters, but it hadn't prepared her for the terrifying reality of being his only ally. She looked down at her starched white apron, now a ruined map of spilled wine and kitchen grime. "I saw the patterns, Dominic," she whispered, her own voice trembling. "They were operating on a precise timeline. If I hadn't disrupted it, you wouldn't have made it to the service station." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant siren of a police cruiser and the low hum of the city. The man behind the mask, the real Dominic Valley, emerged in the way his shoulders finally slumped, a minute surrender to the gravity of the situation. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm as if unsure if he was allowed to touch the person who had just rewritten his fate. The clinical detachment Claire had used to survive her shifts was gone, replaced by the realization that she was no longer an observer of the underworld. She was part of it now, bound to the man behind the secrets by a choice that had taken less than a second to make, but would likely take a lifetime to outrun. The engine of Dominic's sleek, dark sedan finally cut out, leaving a silence that felt heavy and thick in the cramped confines of the underground garage. Claire Sterling didn't move. She stared straight ahead at the concrete wall, her mind replaying the last hour in a frantic, disjointed loop. The clinical detachment her criminal psychology degree had gifted her, the ability to categorize pre-action anxiety, tells, and hypervigilance, was failing her now. In the sterile, fluorescent light of the garage, the blood-red Barolo stains on her apron looked like a map of the bold risk she had taken, a choice that had effectively ended the life she knew. "We're inside the perimeter," Dominic said, his voice dropping into that low, resonant frequency that had always set off alarm bells in Claire's head back at the Golden Fork. He didn't look like the mysterious regular at table 12 anymore. The crack in his professional facade from the getaway remained, revealing a man who was deeply aware that he was now a moving target. He stepped out of the car, his storm-gray eyes scanning the shadows of the safe house with a practiced, lethal intensity. Claire followed him into the elevator, the sudden upward motion making her stomach do that familiar flutter, though this time it wasn't triggered by a handsome regular's request for her section. As the doors opened into a sprawling, minimalist apartment, the reality of her situation settled in like lead. She was a witness. She was an accomplice. And according to the logic of the men in the charcoal suits, she was now a target who needed to be silenced. "Why the Golden Fork, Dominic?" she asked, her voice trembling as she finally turned to face him. She needed to understand the secrets her training had whispered to her for 3 months. "A man like you, with your resources and your enemies, why spend every Friday night sitting in a glass-walled restaurant in the middle of Chicago?" Dominic walked to a heavy oak cabinet, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass. He didn't offer her any. "Every predator has a favorite watering hole, Claire. The fork was mine because it was the one place where I could pretend I was just another well-dressed crowd member celebrating an anniversary or closing a deal." He turned, the shadows of the room playing across his sharp features. "But more than that, I chose it because of you. I saw you reading the room. I saw you watching the subtle hierarchies and unspoken tensions. I knew that if anyone was going to spot a hit squad before they drew their weapons, it would be the waitress with the bun and the psychology degree who was too smart for her own good." Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the apartment's air conditioning. The bold risk hadn't been an accident of fate, it had been a calculated bet on his part. He had used her as his early warning system, banking on her expert reading of social dynamics to save his life. The realization that she had been a piece on his chessboard long before the first shot was fired at table 12 made the safe house feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. The heavy oak door of the apartment latched shut with a finality that seemed to echo through the expansive, minimalist space, leaving Claire Sterling standing in the sudden silence of a world she had only ever observed from a distance. The clinical part of her mind, the part that had earned her a degree in criminal psychology and allowed her to decode the tells of Chicago's underworld from across a dining room, began to process her new surroundings with a cold, analytical precision. She stood in a sprawling safe house, her ruined white apron a stark map of blood-red Barolo stains and kitchen grime, signifying the end of the life she knew. Dominic Valley moved through the apartment with a lethal intensity, his storm-gray eyes scanning the shadows as if expecting the hit squad to materialize through the walls. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the light as he finally turned to address her, revealing that his presence at table 12 had never been a coincidence. Dominic admitted that he had chosen the golden fork specifically because of her. He had watched her watching the room, recognizing that her expert reading of social dynamics and ability to spot a hit squad before they drew their weapons made her his most valuable early warning system. The realization that she had been a tactical pawn long before she took the bold risk of spilling that wine hit her with a weight that made the apartment feel less like a sanctuary and more like a high-end cage. He didn't just want her as a witness or an accidental ally, he wanted her skills. Dominic approached her, his voice low and resonant, offering her a role that would fundamentally change her trajectory. He needed someone who could decode his enemies before they ever got close enough to fire a bullet, someone who could use the science of criminal behavior to navigate the lethal hierarchies he lived in. Claire looked at her hands, still faintly stained with the vintage wine that cost more than 2 days of her wages, and realized the approachable mask she had worn as a waitress was gone forever. She had spent years studying the patterns of people like Dominic from a distance, but now she was being invited to step inside the pattern itself. The pre-action anxiety she had diagnosed in his hunters earlier was now her own constant companion. To accept was to trade her starched apron for a place at his side, using her degree not for a windowless office at the FBI, but as a weapon in a war she was only beginning to understand. As Dominic waited for her answer, the silence of the safe house was broken only by the distant hum of the city, a reminder of the world she had left behind at table 12. Claire Sterling took a deep breath, looked into those storm-gray eyes, and realized that her true education in criminal psychology was about to begin.